Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth of our Sarah Taub webinar series. My name is Alex Bernardi, and as the NCI Director at HSRI, I will be introducing this webinar on National Core Indicators and Autism Spectrum Disorder, putting the data in context. Sarah Taub was the National Core Indicators Director until 2013, when her life was cut short by an aggressive cancer. Her sense of mission and purpose was an essential part of the growth of NCI to the prominence it has today. She was a fierce advocate for people with disabilities and for their representation at all levels in the work we do. She never let us forget the people behind the numbers. We present these periodic webinars on important topics representing issues that matter in people's lives in Sarah's honor. This webinar will use data from the National Core Indicators to examine the demographic characteristics and outcomes for adults on the autism spectrum who receive supports and services from state intellectual and developmental disability systems. Val Bradley, the president of Human Services Research Institute, will kick off and lay out some of the findings in the recent NCI data. Building from these findings, Ari Naiman will provide commentary and policy recommendations. Ari is the president and co-founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. A few words about how we're going to operate this webinar. Please use the call-in number provided in the chat box for your webinar. We will allow time for questions at the end. Use the chat box to type your questions, and our colleague Stephanie Giordano will be passing your questions on to Val and Ari. And we'll be opening the phone lines at the end for those who'd like to ask questions over the phone. I also wanted to mention that for the purposes of this webinar, we wanted to talk about the terminology preferences and language we will be using. Within the autism and autistic communities, there's a wide variety of different linguistic preferences, with some people preferring the use of identity-first language rather than person-first language. So you will note that within this presentation, we will alternate between using person on the autism spectrum and autistic person. There's a link here for more details. Val and Ari, take it away.
Thanks, Alex. As Alex mentioned, this portion of the webinar will cover NCI data, which will help us illuminate some of the issues facing people receiving services who are on the autism spectrum. But before we get into the actual data, I just wanted to do a little bit of an overview to give us some context. We think this particular topic is very timely, given that many states are beginning to expand their eligibility criteria to include more people with autism. And I think it's a good time to sort of stop and think about how their needs for support may be the same or may differ from traditional groups who have been served by state DD agencies. So what are we going to talk about? First of all, sort of an overview of people on the autistic. What do we know about people with autism on the spectrum? Prevalence, characteristics, services and supports, and something about what we already knew before this NCI data about differential outcomes for people on the spectrum. We'll do a brief overview of National Core Indicators and its history and the nature of the data that we collect. Then we'll go into several bits of data that I think paint a picture of the outcomes that autistic adults experience in our public services. Then Ari will discuss policy recommendations reflecting on some of these findings, and then we hope there will be a discussion following. So what do we know about people with autism? We certainly know prevalence of estimates of autism spectrum disorder are rising. Autistic people represent a higher percentage of the population than we previously thought. There are a variety of theories about how and why this trend has accelerated, with some people believing that a portion of the increase in these diagnoses is really that we've gotten better at differentiating between intellectual disability and autism and other forms of mental illness. The proportion of autistic people with co-occurring intellectual disabilities, by some estimates, is as high as 60%. Again, however, there is some question among some in the autism world about the applicability of these standardized tests for people with autism. Autism and state ID, the service systems, there are changes that have happened. In some states, autistic people have been eligible for public ID services in places like California, which had adopted the DD definition a very long time ago from the federal act. And so there are also people who have a primary diagnosis of intellectual disability, but also a co-occurring autism diagnosis, and who also have functional limitations that met the criteria. More recently, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, a number of states, given the advocacy of the autism community, have begun to adopt so-called autism waivers, some of which cover children, some of which cover adults. However, the number of people enrolled has remained somewhat small. Amy Stewart in 2012 estimated that only about 8.1% of individuals receiving public services had been assigned the autism spectrum diagnosis. A lot of you may have heard that recently DSM, the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual 5, took a pretty significant step in redefining autism. It eliminated what had been separate categories of autism disorder, which included pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD, Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, and autistic disorder. Instead, there is now one diagnostic category for the autism spectrum. That was a fairly significant change. So now to be classified on the spectrum, individuals must show deficits in social communication impairment and restrictive interests and repetitive behaviors. It's hoped by more optimistic observers of this change that the use now of a single diagnostic category for autism spectrum disorder within the DSM-5 will result in increased access to services for those who may have met the functional eligibility criteria for IDDD systems, but were excluded because of a diagnosis of PDD or one of the other subcategories. There have been a number of changes in our world generally over the last several decades, including the rights now in the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, the ADA, the IDEA, the Rehab Act. So there have been significant changes and reforms and progress in our field, led certainly to the growth of community-based services, and we now have public policy that encourages inclusion. However, the people with autism and people on the autism spectrum do not appear to have benefited to the same extent as those without autism. Research has certainly shown poor adult life outcomes in areas such as independent living, community inclusion. Also, some of the research on teens in schools has shown that people on the spectrum fare much worse than students with intellectual disabilities in such areas as physical well-being, social support, and psychological well-being. So now, with that backdrop, let's look at some of the NCI data and what it tells us about outcomes for autistic adults receiving services. First of all, just a very brief overview. Hopefully most of you are already familiar with national core indicators, but NCI is a collaboration really among the National Association for DD Services, us at HSRI, and state DD directors. It's a multi-state collaboration, goes back to 1997 in 13 participating states. We're now in 45 states, which is quite extraordinary. including the District of Columbia, a group of counties in Ohio, and all of the regional centers, all 21 regional centers in California, which, by the way, because of California's traditional eligibility criteria, does mean that the NCI database now has substantially more individuals within it with a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. The goal of NCI has always been to help public managers measure the outcomes of their services, to benchmark their performance with other states, and to dig into specific outcomes and domains such as employment, community inclusion, choice, rights, relationships, service satisfaction, etc. This is just a map of where NCI has been implemented. You can see there's very little white space anymore, and we hope in the next couple of years to have all of those states filled in. But it does mean we've reached critical mass, and that the national data really does reflect the diversity in terms of urban and rural and cultural diversity across the country. The data source that the data is drawn from that I'm going to present comes from the Adult Consumer Survey, which is really the linchpin of NCI. As you probably know, it's a standardized face-to-face survey with a minimum sample of 400 randomly selected individuals in each state. It includes 3 parts. The first part is background information, including health and other socio-demographic figures, data. Section 1, where we don't allow proxies, where the individual, if he or she is capable, will answer. If they're not, no proxies are allowed, primarily because those are sort of intersubjective judgments. Section 2, more instrumental questions, we do allow proxies. We do not, when we train the interviewers, we tell them that there should be no pre-screening procedures. You don't walk into a room and say, oh, I'm sure this person isn't going to be able to answer. You proceed with the survey, giving the person the benefit of the doubt. This is, keep in mind, a survey of only adults, people who are 18 or over, and the survey usually takes, on the average, about 50 minutes. So data for this presentation comes from the NCI Consumer Survey that was implemented in 2013-2014. That data collection year, we had 30 states, plus the District of Columbia and 1 sub-state entity. Altogether, that year, 15,525 surveys were collected, and the subsample of that number was pulled using the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in the background section. The people who met that criteria for this analysis totaled about 2,277 individuals. So what do the data show about autistic adults receiving state IDDD services? First, let's look at the demographics. I think probably most people are aware that the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder occurs much more frequently among males than it does females. Although, again, there are people in the autism community who would suggest that there's an underdiagnosis among females. Only 25% of those in our sample who had an ASD diagnosis were female. Level of ID varies, although on some of the indices towards the profound level, there's slightly more people on the spectrum with profound ID. Nothing really stands out there. The sample, the subsample that we have shows that the individuals are much younger than their opposite numbers with intellectual disabilities and no ASD. I think primarily since a lot of these individuals came into the system recently, weren't deinstitutionalized, weren't receiving services over a long period of time. So the proportion of people in our subsample who were between 18 and 22 is about 21% compared to 5% of people who don't have a diagnosis of ASD. So this, keep in mind as we look at these data, that the individuals that we're focusing on are primarily younger than the other members of the sample. And the percent of those with and without the ASD diagnosis by residents shows that people with on the autism spectrum disorder are more likely to live in independent homes and apartments and community-based residences. More individuals in the subsample with autism have a mental health diagnosis. We divide up the notion of a mental health diagnosis comes from 3 different areas in the survey. People were said to have mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and behavior challenges. And I think you can see that people, autistic adults, are much more likely to be said to have behavior challenges. 49% of those with ASD, as you can see from the dark green bar, have behavior challenges. This is really startling. More individuals with autism have guardians, a significantly higher number. So you can see that people who have an ASD diagnosis, 63% had a guardian. People with autism less likely to live in their own home or apartment. You can see that only about 0.1% have their own home or apartment, whereas 22% of people without who were not on the autism spectrum disorder lived in their own apartment or home. Again, not surprisingly, fewer people on the autism spectrum use words to speak. Here we see about 30% of individuals who have ASD use gestures or body language to communicate, compared to only 17% of those who do not have the diagnosis. And again, if you look at people who use words to speak, 62% of people on the spectrum use words to speak, compared to 77% of those without the ASD diagnosis. Though we don't have a great track record of employing folks in public ID systems so far, people on the autism spectrum are even more or less likely to have paid jobs in the community, 13% compared to 16%. And they're more likely to be employed in more institutional congregate settings. On virtually every aspect of our choice scale, people, autistic adults, make fewer choices about where they live, who they live with, their staff, what they do during the day, their day activities, what they purchase, and whether or not they choose their case managers. So this is a very striking graph. And finally, and not hugely, but still sadly, autistic adults are less likely to have friends, and these comparisons are significant. So just to sum up, as I think I said in the introduction here, people with autism compared to their to individuals who do not have a diagnosis but have intellectual disabilities are experiencing less favorable outcomes really across the board, which really strongly suggests the need to figure out what kinds of interventions are more likely to work to make sure people with autism are included in a variety of the supports that others in the system are receiving. And I think these are some of the things that Ari will be touching on.
Thank you, Val, for presenting what we know about people on the autism spectrum who are receiving services from state DD system in the National Core Indicators data. Now we're going to turn it over to Ari Naiman, who is going to talk through some of the policy initiatives that we are looking at and that we know about that may enhance outcomes for people on the autism spectrum or autistic adults. Over to you, Ari.
Wonderful. Well, we'll move forward. Val, thank you for an excellent presentation, made all the more impressive by virtue of doing it without visual aids. So I'll just jump right into this and talk a little bit about some of the policy implications of the data that you just described. One of the first areas I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is the research agenda with regards to autism. NCI data is one of the most valuable research data sets that we have with regards to developmental disability services writ large. And one of the challenges that we see is that right now, very little of the federal autism research investment in autism goes towards research on studying the needs of adults with disabilities, on the needs of autistic adults, as well as the services and supports going to autistic people of any age. As of 2010, which is the last year of which NIH made data available, only 1.5% of the research agenda went towards autistic adults, and only 2.45%, less than 2.5%, went towards services research. The two largest autism research funders privately, the federal government is the largest public funder, NIH is the largest public funder, had in fact even a lower percentage of their research investment going towards adults and services research. And that presents a number of challenges. One of the challenges it presents is that, as Val mentioned earlier, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that autism is not, in fact, increasing, but rather than an increase in the number of autistic people, we are instead seeing an increase in the diagnosis of autism as a result of identification of a pre-existing population. Data from that comes from a few different sources. Some of it is that we see trend lines changing in other diagnostic categories as we see an increase in autism diagnoses. Some of it is the changing diagnostic criteria for autism. And some of it is also the fact that when we have seen population-level health surveillance, similar to what the CDC does for 8-year-olds, applied to adults, we find the same percentage of autism in adults as in children. So far, that study has only been conducted in the United Kingdom, but it's suggestive of the fact that autism holds constant among age cohorts. The fact that in the US, relatively little investment has gone towards that kind of research is a problem, not only because it keeps the question open around incidence versus increased prevalence versus increased diagnosis, but more relevantly because if we are in fact seeing an increase in diagnosis rather than an increase in incidence, we have a very large population of people who have had their service needs unmet for a very long time. And I think that's something, chances are, everyone could get behind, the understanding that autistic people, particularly autistic adults, are not having their service needs met, and we benefit from research into how we can improve service quality. There are a variety of different areas of research which represent promising avenues of exploration, some of which that I think are particularly relevant in the context of Val's discussion of NCI data include research on disparities in access to diagnosis. For example, Val mentioned the significantly larger number of boys than girls, of men than women in the NCI data set who have an autism diagnosis. The data around autistic women and the research around autistic women suggests that while we don't know what the actual ratio of men to women on the autism spectrum is the current data, the current diagnostic ratio may, in fact, be distorted somewhat by the significant underdiagnosis of women and girls. And part of the reason we know that is for the same reason we see significant underdiagnosis of racial and ethnic minority groups and low-income populations. Women and girls, like racial and ethnic minority groups and low-income individuals, are likely to receive a diagnosis later in life. Those that do receive a diagnosis are more likely to have a co-occurring intellectual disability or speech impairment. And what that's indicative of is essentially the idea that we're really only spotting the most obvious cases when it comes to autism in girls. And so again, a more inclusive research agenda might begin to look at how we can be more effective in closing some of those diagnostic disparities. Another area of promise in the research sector is the need for participatory action research models. Participatory action research and its cousin, community-based participatory research, are research models in which autistic people, or whatever population of people who are the target of research, are involved as full partners in the research process, usually with the person from that population participating as a co-principal investigator, a community-based organization, having some level of substantial involvement. ASAN has worked on a variety of participatory action research projects, including some with HSRI, as well as others with other universities and NIH and NIMH projects. But our feeling is, and I think some of the data we've looked at suggests that it may be valuable to increase the allocation of funds to those kinds of more participatory approaches, in that insights can be born from the target population. Those of us on the autism spectrum often have insights as to the nature of autism that are not immediately apparent to non-autistic persons. I want to talk a little bit about the area of long-term services and supports, and I would imagine this is an area of considerable interest to many of our listeners. There is a recognition that there are significant challenges in this area, both in terms of the quality and in terms of the availability of long-term services and supports. First, I'll start by saying that not all autistic people are qualifying for long-term services and supports, and the population that doesn't qualify is by and large not showing up in the NCI data set, since NCI surveys individuals who are in state DD systems. A significant number of autistic adults do not meet an institutional level of care. And the challenge here is that you've got this population that essentially may experience significant functional challenges, may require some form of ongoing support above and beyond that which is typically provided by a state vocational rehabilitation agency, or by an independent living center, or by a school system, but does not qualify for Medicaid home and community-based services, since the HCBS waiver is explicitly structured as an alternative to institutionalization. Increasingly, we're starting to see the emerging use of a state plan authority by some states called 1915I that allows states to utilize Medicaid funds to provide home and community-based services to targeted populations, including those that do not meet an institutional level of care. For example, Delaware recently launched a 1915I state plan benefit specifically targeted around serving people with disabilities of all kinds who are transition age, and supporting them in moving into integrated employment. One of the unique things about this Delaware benefit was that it explicitly included autistic adults who do not meet level of care. And that represents something very important. It really ensures that for somebody who isn't going to qualify for DD services, but nonetheless needs more support after leaving school, there is a pathway. And it's our hope other states will adopt these kinds of targeted benefits in the future. With respect to the population that is already receiving home and community-based services, there's also a need for some substantial change. Val mentioned that autistic people are more likely to be in provider-owned residential settings, and also mentioned that autistic people are more likely to live with their families. And in both respects, there's a need for additional investment. Many states have relatively minimal investments in family support services. This, in my view, represents a significant mistake, a significant problem, both by virtue of the unmet need, but also by virtue of the fact that the data around autism shows that respite care and family support are two of the most effective kinds of services that we can see to drastically reduce the risk of institutionalization among autistic children and adolescents. The new CMS home and community-based settings rule explicitly encourages states to shift away from provider-owned residential settings. It doesn't make them impermissible, but it holds them to a higher standard, in part because of the urging of self-advocates and the recognition that people tend to have less choice and control in provider-owned settings, which is also reinforced by NCI data. And so we anticipate that the settings rule will encourage some of those shifts, and that autistic people may significantly benefit as a result of that. As mentioned, the settings rule is encouraging shifts in housing models. So what that means is states that have relied heavily on group homes and other congregate models may now be moving towards supported living and shared living models. NCI data enforces that folks have more likelihood to choose their activities, choose what they do during the day, engage in other forms of choices in smaller settings, and in settings in which real estate and service provision are not combined. Now, in order to accomplish that, states need to establish rental subsidies programs to make supported living viable. One of the biggest reasons we have group homes is not because somebody sat down and really decided, boy, doesn't that sound so nice to share staff and share a small building with 6 other people. It's really because of the cost of housing and the fact that Medicaid dollars cannot be utilized for room and board. And so if we're going to make progress in implementing the settings rule and in supporting autistic people to exert their right under the settings rule to have a choice of settings to live in, including non-disability specific settings, there's a very strong need for states to explore, even through utilizing state funds, rental subsidy programs. We've certainly advocated for allowing Medicaid dollars to be utilized on a limited basis for rental subsidies in settings compliant with the Money Follows the Person program, but current law does not allow that. Similarly, one of the reasons why it's concerning that autistic people are more likely to end up in congregate models is that they frequently replicate the dynamics of the institution, whereby an individual does not have choice and control over what they do on a day-to-day basis. The word choice is thrown around quite a lot, often by folks who are arguing for very restrictive settings. And I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about choice, we should be talking about it in an ongoing sense. So to say to somebody, well, you can choose between this group home or that gated community, or you can go on your own, or you have to live with your parents forever, or whatever it is not a meaningful choice. It's not an informed choice very often. And the key barometer of choice is, do you have the ability to choose who provides you with support, to choose what you do, to choose where you go, to choose where you live, and then continue to maintain that ability on an ongoing basis. Most people don't think of choice as something we do once and then, be done with it. choice is an ongoing and iterative process for everyone, including autistic people and other people with disabilities. So that's something that we in the self-advocacy movement advocate a lot around. In the employment sector, 5 states have or are committing to phasing out sheltered workshops. This has been driven in part because of the growing employment first movement, but also because of Olmstead litigation around integrated employment. We've got this recognition that just as we said, you know what, you don't have to live in a big congregate setting, you know, in order to get services to support you in a residential context. We can probably say the same thing around employment as well. But the reality is that integrated day services are just as critical to the employment discussion as actual employment services. Very frequently, when we close a workshop, you know, some of the folks there are going to find integrated employment, and that's great. Some folks are not going to find that in the near term. We're going to keep on working on that, but that's more of a long-term process. And one of the ways in which we can say honestly and sincerely that closing the workshop is still a good idea, and I believe that it is by having a truly robust set of integrated day services that are more than just saying, okay, we're going to bus you around in a little van, you know, but really give people choice and control. And do not force folks to follow a program-wide or facility-wide schedule, but instead integrate people within the broader community. You know, the real value proposition there is that it's often the case that for someone who is making well below minimum wage, may only be making a few cents an hour, that person may in fact be better off in integrated non-work than in segregated work, particularly because we know that sheltered workshops really do not serve to effectively transition people into integrated work and are often associated with poor long-term outcomes. But even for the population that does end up leaving a sheltered workshop and moving into integrated employment, integrated day services are often very relevant in large part because you may not be able to find integrated employment for 40 hours a week right away, or for some people ever. And so there's often a desire to ensure that people still have access to, if they want it, structured integrated day services to fill out some of the rest of that time. So if somebody's leaving a sheltered workshop where they were working 7 hours a day and were making a few dollars a day, and moves into an integrated employment setting in which they're then working 2 or 3 hours a day, making more money, but still want support to have something more to do than sit at home for the rest of that time, integrated day becomes very important. There's legislation now pending in the Senate, the Transition to Independence Act, I believe it's S1604, introduced by Senator Grassley, Senator Casey, and Senator Wyden, that would shift funds and incentivize states to shift funds from sheltered work and facility-based day have into integrated employment and integrated day have. Finally, as was mentioned earlier, autistic people are now more likely to be under guardianship or conservatorship. And there's sort of a growing movement to move away from guardianship or conservatorship, in particular to develop additional options so that folks don't default into it if they require some decision-making support. Internationally, this is being driven by Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. We don't really believe in international human rights treaties in the United States, so it's not so much driven by Article 12 here. But there's a growing movement towards supported decision-making in the US as well. In fact, on ASAN's website, we just released a comprehensive plain language report on supported decision-making with the very explicit goal of explaining some of the different national models out there to make it easier for states to adopt supported decision-making structures. Texas was the first state to adopt a supported decision-making law. and a number of other states are currently considering doing so. The resource is called The Right to Make Choices, new resource on supported decision making, and we'll make sure it gets included in the list of resources that are sent out with this recording. ASAN has model state legislation on healthcare supported decision making. And in order to really scale supported decision making, one of the things that needs to be done is to work through some of the liability issues so that financial and healthcare providers really feel more comfortable with the model. I'm going to close here, and Val and I will take questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have now we're coming through the phone line. I've just muted our computer for a moment. If you have any questions for Ari or Val, go ahead and type it into the chat box. I see that we do have a number of people who are still on the computers, and on their computers. It seems that mostly people are using their computer speakers, so that will work fine. We may have to type some responses in from HSRI if we need to. But if you have any questions, please go ahead and add them. I will say now, as people, if people are adding in some of their questions, we are going to be, this has been recorded, and we will be making the recording available. It will be on the HSRI, the National Core Indicators website, and I will include the website link in the chat box in a minute. I should also say, this is Val, that we will be posting PowerPoint with chart on our National Core Indicators.org website under resources, the resources tab, and then presentations, and it will be the ASD Webinar PowerPoint. And again, we apologize for the lack of actual data, but that PowerPoint will be available. Go ahead, Al. Okay, I'm seeing from a number of people that we're echoing badly, and I'm not sure whether I think Ari, you probably have your phone muted.
I don't know.
We will go back onto the telephone line.
We'll go back onto the telephone line, onto the computer line in a minute.
I think you've got to mute your microphone. You've muted, what you did is, I think you turned off the speakers. You need to remember to mute your microphone as well. I could be mistaken. Okay, that seemed to work. We will hopefully take some questions shortly. If I could invite folks to write their questions into the chat window. Type away. And I see several of you are typing.
We'll be back to you in just a minute. We're trying to solve the audio problem here.